I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Today's question of the day: what's up with Jim Acosta, the Women's March and Ghostbusters 4? Now, the reason I'm asking that weird sounding question is because these items have been in the news in the last week or so, and I thought I'd put them all together in one video and share my brief comments on each. First of all, Jim Acosta, he lost his press pass and then he got his press pass back again, and the White House has got some new rules around journalists who have those press passes, all because of an incident a couple of weeks ago, which is not just one incident, by the way. This is a pattern of behaviour that's been going on for many months now with Jim Acosta, and it finally came to a head a couple of weeks ago when he prevented a female intern at the White House from taking back the microphone off him after he'd basically gone on a bit of an activist type rant. He was making a bit of a goose of himself, and the president said, right, that's it, next question. He kept trying to persist. The intern went to relieve him of the microphone and take it to the next journalist, so actual journalists could ask questions. And instead, what does Acosta do? He sort of pushes against her arm and prevents her from actually doing her job. And then, of course, he loses his credentials. Now, I'm astounded that anyone is trying to make the argument that I've heard some people trying to make here, that his human rights were violated. No, they weren't. The freedom of the press was not violated here either. The simple fact is that he wasn't imprisoned, he wasn't silenced in any way, he wasn't punished in any way. He simply had a privilege revoked when he abused that privilege. No one is entitled to a White House press pass as a human right. The freedom of the press does not depend on having a White House press pass at all. He can still report, he can still engage, he can still be a journalist and speak freely about issues without that privilege. But as I said, he abused that privilege. And to be fair, you got the sense, looking around that room and watching that video a couple of weeks ago, that there were a lot of journalists in that room who were just thinking to themselves, man, I wish this guy would stop this absurd grandstanding. It's kind of embarrassing. The second thing that's interesting about this Jim Acosta incident for me is the reporting about a week or so ago that happened. Paul Joseph Watson published a video in which he actually showed Acosta physically pushing back against that female staffer at the White House when she went to try and relieve him of the microphone. And immediately the press went wild and claimed that this was a doctored video. It wasn't doctored. All he did was play the video, and he zoomed in at one point to actually show specifically what was happening, where Jim Acosta's hands, his arms were in relation to the intern. That was it. That's not doctoring a video. It wasn't doctored, but the media ran with the story. And what that showed me was that the media is just willing to tell out and out lies. For whatever reason, they are willing to lie, just to stand there stony-faced and lie to the public. And that's a real big problem. Not only that, but that problem is then compounded as this fake story about a doctored video makes its way around the world. It ends up here in New Zealand in one of our local newspapers. And of course, they ran with the headline in the story that it was a doctored video. Now, what that tells you is that there is very little actual fact-checking going on in the mainstream media now. The newspaper here in New Zealand that received that story didn't actually bother to verify the factual accuracy of what they were publishing. And that, unfortunately, is a far too common trend now. So this whole incident, on top of the absurdity of the claims that were being made, really once again exposes how troubling the conduct of the mainstream media has now become, and how unreliable they actually are in a lot of cases when it comes to getting accurate information. The second item in the news this week was the Women's March, and the reason the Women's March is in the news is because Teresa Snook, who is the founder of the Women's March, has come out and has publicly lambasted the current co-chairs, the organising committee of the march, and said that they need to resign because of their racism, their anti-Semitism and their anti-LGBT sentiments. Now, one of these co-chairs is none other than Linda Sarsour, and a bit of a spat has erupted between the co-chairs and Teresa Snook. Now, I'm not at all surprised by this, because from the very beginning it was obvious that the Women's March was not actually founded on a proactive and positive vision for human flourishing, for societal flourishing. It was simply a reactionary and reactive response to something, an attack against something. Now, there are times when you are going to have to engage in reactive activism. However, that reactive activism, whether it's a protest march or, I don't know, whatever it is you're going to do, but that should always be underpinned and founded on and motivated by a proactive vision for human flourishing and societal unity. That actually is the thing that motivates you to speak out against the thing that might pose a threat to that. But this march never had that. All it had was the reactive, reactionary, sort of divisive type stuff. And so I'm kind of not surprised now that this event is starting to descend into division, because effectively when you promote something without a proactive, positive vision, you're ultimately leading people into a form of chaos. And what does chaos do? It just begets more chaos. So I'm kind of not surprised that this is now starting to happen, that they didn't think too clearly about what they stood for. Because if they'd thought more clearly about what they stood for, then certain people probably wouldn't have been included on the organisational committee. Of course, the grand irony here is that they went out of their way to publicly denounce any pro-life females who wanted to join the Women's March. And so it's kind of ironic here that this whole thing is now imploding in I guess, a never-ending circle of the oppression Olympics and victimization and claims of victimization and who said what about who. I'm not surprised. Lastly, Ghostbusters 4. That's right. Dan Aykroyd recently said that he is working on a script for a brand new Ghostbusters movie. Now, don't panic. It's not going to involve the cast of the Ghostbusters reboot. He is talking about effectively ignoring the reboot and writing Ghostbusters 3, which would actually feature the original cast. Well, obviously not all of the original cast, but the still living members of the original cast. Now, when I first heard this news, I thought, yay, cool, Ghostbusters 3. But then I stopped and thought to myself a little bit longer, and I thought, hold on a minute, Ghostbusters 2, which actually wasn't such a great outing for the Ghostbusters franchise. So it all depends on what exactly it is that Dan Aykroyd is writing here. And it got me thinking, what would be an ideal kind of Ghostbusters 3? And I think what you'd want to do is, you wouldn't just want to retell any of the previous two stories. You don't want to just repeat the formula here. I think you want to go back to what was so good and the heart and the genius of that first film. And what was the heart and the genius of that first film? It was a bunch of guys trying to start their own small business, a bunch of entrepreneurs who are trying to get a startup off the ground. And that's really what they should go back to, except obviously you don't want to have them starting a small business again. Perhaps you want to have them exploring their senior years and their journey into retirement and trying to capture their lost youth and all of those kind of things that older guys begin to look back on and question about their legacy. Now that could have some potential in it. However, I'm not holding my breath. First of all, there's no guarantees that the script will ever see the light of day, that will ever actually become a movie. And secondly, I'm not really holding my breath, because the simple fact is that Hollywood and big movie making hasn't really got a very good track record at the moment when it comes to actually going back into and delving into and either rebooting or adding sequels to much beloved existing franchises. And as I said, there's Ghostbusters 2, which happened already, and so we know there's a real potential here for this to go astray. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think about any of those things in the comment section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on PayPal or Patreon. There is a link for both in the video description below. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you next week on The Daily Question.